Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Gallo from Harvard Business Review. And today I'm talking with Morra Aarons-Mele, the host of the HBR Presents podcast, The Anxious Achiever. Morra, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's good to be here, Amy.
I probably don't have to tell all of you, we are living through unprecedentedly uncertain times, and many of us are feeling anxious. I saw a comment on Twitter recently that someone said that she had broken down in the middle of a Zoom meeting with all of her staff. I talked to a friend who told me that she hasn't slept more than 4 hours a night since March, since she's terribly worried about losing her job. And that's what we want to talk to you all about today: anxiety as it relates to this crisis and our work and our careers. We want to answer as many of your questions as possible, so please chime in the comments. Let us know what you're feeling, what you're thinking about, what you're worried about, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. A little bit more about Morra. In addition to being a podcast host, Morra also is the founder of the social impact agency Women Online and an author of the book Hiding in the Bathroom, which is a great book. I highly recommend it. She also recently wrote a feature article for HBR, which is available now online, called Leading Through Anxiety, and I recommend checking it out. So let's get started. Morra, my very first question for you is, what are you feeling most anxious about these days as it relates to work and career?
How long have we got? So I think for me, I don't know if this is true for you, Amy, my anxiety kind of changes every day. Sometimes it's based on the headlines. So for example, yesterday, all this news came out about how COVID may be affecting children. And I have 3 young children, and so that's where my anxiety went. Last week, I was working through PPP, getting the loan from the CARES Act for my small business. And so my anxiety went there. I almost think of my anxiety as a bunch of water, and it will go into whatever vessel is most pressing or wherever my brain is focusing. I don't know. Sense.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. I mean, I think that I feel the same, that it's just this fluctuating, a little bit like whack-a-mole almost for me. Like one anxiety pops up and I feel like I get it under control, and then another one, like you said, the news about children being affected by COVID yesterday was really, really hard as a mother. One of the things that I'm noticing is that if I had felt the level of anxiety I feel right now 6 months ago, I would have been really worried. And I just feel like we all have this heightened level of anxiety. And I'm curious if you think that our baseline has just gotten higher. Are we just sort of accepting that we have higher levels of anxiety, and has our the point at which we get concerned, has that just gotten higher?
How could it not, right? So I think that we're living in a time that for most of us is very strange. Logistically, physically. So our entire routine has been disrupted, which makes us anxious. The news is anxious. We feel that the people in charge also are anxious and have no idea what the future holds, right? Dr. Fauci will say, we think it's going to be really bad, but he doesn't have a crystal ball. So, as humans, we tune in. That's what we do. We take our cues. And when everything that we've built our society and our systems around is just totally disrupted, how could we not be anxious?
Yeah.
I think what I want to say, though, which is that this level of anxiety is actually kind of normal for me. And because I have an anxiety disorder, and if anyone out there watching is like, actually, this feels normal to me. Like I've been waiting for this, and it's finally happening. I think you're not alone. Those of us with anxiety disorders, I don't feel like this 365 days a year, but when I'm in an anxious cluster, I will feel like this. I felt like this last fall for a good 2.5 months, and the world was okay then, theoretically. So
relatively speaking,
depends on your own anxiety, right? It all depends on your own anxiety baseline too.
Yeah, and you say in the article you wrote for us that those with anxiety disorders were made for this moment. Can you tell me a little bit about what Like, what are the coping mechanisms you've developed that you think make it, make you equipped to handle this?
It's interesting, and that sounds flip, but I think that those of us with clinical anxiety can sort of take heart in a way that finally everything we've been preparing for might have a use, because when you live with anxiety, you may rehearse through several of your worst scenarios, right?
Mm.
So if one of your worst scenarios is, I'm going to I run a small business, I'm not going to have any new business coming in because people don't like me, right? That might be your anxiety thing in normal times. Well, I better have a plan B.
Right.
Right. And you may have
Yeah.
worked through the plan B. You may have a thing where you stockpile food and supplies. I did. I talked to one woman who, she said, my friends always made fun of me because I was always the person who had like 87 flashlights and enough food to last me 3 months if I needed to.
Right.
And now I have that. And so in a way, the rehearsing for worst case scenario planning that those of us with anxiety tend to live with every day now has a channel that we can put it towards.
Yeah. Well, and it's almost like all that worrying feels justified in some ways right now for folks. And I've definitely heard that from.
Which is a terrible thing, right?
It is.
Objectively, okay, wait, I didn't really want this to happen. I mean, it sort of makes you step back and look at your relationship with your anxiety.
Right.
But in many ways, I have felt less anxious at times during this pandemic than people who had never felt anxiety before, because I'm used to feeling uncomfortable and scared.
That's interesting. So for those of us just joining, I'm Amy Gallo, editor at HBR, and I'm talking with Morra Aarons-Mele, host of the HBR podcast, The Anxious Achiever, about coping with anxiety. We want to answer as many of your questions as possible, so please use the comments. Let us know what's on your mind. What are you most worried about as it relates to work and your career? So Morra, I want to ask a little bit about those coping mechanisms. We actually have a question here from Ashik from India, who's talking about getting back to work but feeling lazy, and it's hard to innovate or focus with everything going on. Any advice for people who are just really struggling to stay focused, to stay motivated, especially when anxiety is really weighing on them?
Well, thank you for your question. And Ashish, I feel it. I think it's really helpful to think of your brain as a computer CPU, right? You only have so many gigs in your brain. And the crazy thing about anxiety is it uses up a lot of your hard drive. It's like when the computer starts overheating, because your planning, all the things that you might normally apply to creativity, to planning your day, to all your work life is being used instead for your anxiety, right? All the what ifs. And so what I find really helpful is I'll say to myself, brain, let's open up some CPU, right? I know that we're scared, and I know that there's a lot of what ifs and there's a lot of things to think about, but today, between 10 o'clock and 5 o'clock while I'm at work, I'm going to open up my CPU for the work that I need to get done. It's a little bit of mindfulness mixed with a little bit of cognitive behavioral techniques. But if you can literally see your brain as that hard drive that you need to clean out, you might be able to free up some time to focus when you need to. And then say to your brain, okay, brain, after work is done, I'm going to worry. I'm going to go back to the what ifs.
I can even imagine cleaning out that CPU. I love that metaphor. Could, helping with that could be writing down, what am I worrying about? I mean, I think one of the things I find is that in the past 9 weeks, when I've been really anxious about something, I've sort of kept it. I feel like I keep it right here in my chest. And I think, well, I'm just going to keep it there. I'm just going to keep it there so I can focus, or I can be a mom, or I can clean the house, whatever it is I need to do. But then it just sort of, it keeps taking up that space. And so I find I need to get it out. And that might be writing it down, talking to my partner about it, right? Just sort of getting it out of that, wherever it lives in your body at that moment.
Well, you're right, because it is living in your body. And when it's living in your chest, it's hampering your breathing,
Mm-hmm.
which makes you anxious, right? Because you can't breathe well. And
Yep.
it's affecting your voice. I did an interview, it hasn't aired yet, with Poppy Jaman, who's an OBE in the UK, which means the Queen has named her. She's a wonderful person, and she's a big mental health advocate. And she said that over the years, she has learned that she literally puts her anxiety in her throat and
Mm.
her jaw.
Mm.
And so she'll find if she's anxious at work, she can't talk as well, she can't project her voice. It
Mm.
literally affects her work. And so the
Right.
reason why I love the idea of freeing up your hard drive and taking it out of your body
Mm-hmm.
is that you want your voice, you want your breath, you want to be
Mm.
present at work. And so I love the idea of writing it down. Amy,
Mm.
you told me once that you have a worry hour. I don't know if you want
Mm-hmm.
to talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
If that works for you.
Yeah, well, I am fortunate to live with a therapist who actually gave me this trick, which is that, I just decide on a time, oftentimes it's like 7 to 8 at night after dinner, but not close enough to bed that it'll keep me up. But it's just where I give myself permission to just worry and think through what are the things I'm really worried about. And it does clear that hard drive, as you said. It sort of gives me more space. And I mean, I think one of the things about holding my anxiety in my chest is the other thing is at the beginning of all this, I was also noticing I was starting to mimic symptoms of COVID. So I was feeling this tightness in my chest or short of breath. And I realized, oh, actually that's anxiety, not symptoms. And I think that's one of the things that's been hard to decipher between all of us, because we are so much worried about our physical body,
Absolutely.
that the anxiety is manifesting itself there, but then also mimicking things that we're anxious about.
Well, and anxiety is a full body reaction, right? Not everyone may manifest their anxiety the same physically. There's no
Mm-hmm.
one way. For some people, it goes into their chest. Some people put it in their jaw and their neck. Some people hunch over like they're physically protecting themselves. Some people get a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms. There are a million different ways. I get a twitch in my eye here, which is annoying.
Yeah.
But I say in the article that really understanding your tells
Mm-hmm.
is powerful. And that's what Poppy was basically saying, is she calls it her stress signatures, which is a very elegant way
Love
of
that.
saying
Yeah.
it. What are my stress signatures, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. So for those of us just joining us, I'm Amy Gallo, editor at HBR, and I'm talking with Morra Aarons-Mele, the host of the HBR podcast, The Anxious Achiever, about coping with anxiety and uncertainty at work during this time. We will be answering as many of your questions as possible, so please keep posting them in the comments. We have a question from Vanessa from Brooklyn, who's asking, is it worth meditating? Which I think is a funny question. I'm sure meditation teachers would love to hear that question. But I wanted you to address this question because I have tried really hard to meditate. I'm not a regular meditator. I'm a, sort of a in and out when it works. And I have found it nearly impossible to do right now. So I'm curious your take on that as a coping mechanism.
Oh, Vanessa, I love that question, because I feel that those of us who are anxious achievers probably are like, darn it, I'm a bad meditator. I have to become a good meditator. I got to conquer this, right? Because it's like whatever we feel that we should do and we can't do that well, it just is another thing that we have to master. So I would love to tell you that being a good meditator is not something that you need to ever put on your CV, right? And that you need to let any pressure to be an expert meditator go, especially at this time. I think that meditation is overwhelming to a lot of us, but what I love to think of are little mindfulness tricks that I can use in a heartbeat. So the computer CPU thing that I just mentioned is actually meditating. Does that make sense? And for those of you who may have just tuned in, we had a question about what happens when you're working or you're heading to work or you're going back to work after being out of work for a little bit because of the pandemic, and you can't focus because you're so anxious. And I said, well, sometimes it's helpful to think of that anxious brain as an overtaxed computer hard drive, and you've got to free up some gigs. And so I have a program called Clean My Mac, and it's a little cute pink icon, and I click the icon and it gets all the junk out of my Mac. And so you could literally think, I'm going to clean the anxiety out of my brain for a little while. That's a meditation.
Yeah.
Taking 2 minutes to breathe is a meditation. If you are the kind of person who is very anxious, but it might work to say, but you know what? I'm healthy and I'm grateful for that. That's a meditation. It's anything that pulls you out of the worry spiral and opens up a little bit of space to put in a different thought or a different energy. So take the pressure off yourself. You do not need to sit cross-legged on the floor for 3 hours. Is there a trick that will work for you, or a visualization? Because visual images are very powerful for people. Is there a song you can sing? I've talked to a lot of people who have a singing meditation, so that and I actually tried this with my son, if you're in a spiral, is there a verse of a song? It just is anything that interrupts the cycle. That's right. Mindfulness.
You know, it's what you're reminding me. I'm actually going to show you all. I have this Post-it. This was pre-COVID, but I put it on my up here on my desk because it's a friend's daughter's school. This is the mantra they say every morning, and it is, my body is calm, my heart is kind, I am the boss of my brain and my mind. And for me, it's the thing that I go to, like in these moments, because, you know, often my stress is here, sitting at my desk, getting emails, talking to people. It's that thing where I go to when I have that feeling in my chest, my tell, as you call it, Morra. I look at that and I read it. Sometimes I even say it out loud to myself.
That's right. It's whatever works for you to recapture the space between the anxious feeling and the fear response.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about anxiety and work. And we have a great question from Letitia from Chicago, who says, how can I communicate to my manager that I'm struggling with anxiety? I think this is something so many of us are facing. We see everywhere, everyone's feeling more anxious, but we don't actually admit that to the people we work with all the time. What advice do you have for her?
I think the fact that you're asking the question is the first step, because you're in touch with the fact that you're anxious. And so I just applaud you for that, because knowing that this is going to be something that you're going to bring with you to work is really important. And I want to give a plug actually to Dr. Ellen Hendrickson, who she's a psychologist. She has an article in our Leading with Anxiety package about, I have it here because I love it so much. And it's when anxiety becomes unbearable. So the thing I would ask you, Letitia, is, is your anxiety bearable? Do you think that you can get through the workday with some hiccups? Yes. Or is it really bad? Because that's a question that you have to ask. We're all in a very fragile state. So honor yourself by thinking, can I go back to work? If the answer is, I'm okay, I may have some moments during the day that I need to address, then I would think about, and it all depends again on what kind of relationship you have with your manager, what kind of culture it is. But I think it's really okay to schedule some one-on-one time with your manager right now and say, this is a tough time. I've been having some big feelings. If there is something in your life that is making you extra anxious, Ellen talks about in her article, my sister is a nurse in New York City. She's on the front lines, or, I have a kid with asthma. If you're comfortable saying that to your manager, that might help them understand more in a visceral way, and saying, I'm excited to be here. This isn't going to impact my work, but, a lot of us may be having feelings right now. And that may prompt your manager to say, gosh, I've been anxious too. This is a really tough time. But I think it's okay to do that if you feel like that's the kind of office you have. I've also gotten questions from people who've said, we don't even acknowledge any emotion in my office. The idea that I would go tell my manager that I'm anxious is like telling them that I have 4 heads.
Right.
Okay. Okay, you know that. Good.
Yeah.
Then what you need to do is think about the infrastructure you need to put in place for yourself to be able to get through the day. And whether that's having a therapy session that your boss doesn't need to know you're going to therapy, building in time to take a walk, really, I call it your critical infrastructure. Having peers you can talk to, having a safe person to talk to, making sure that you're taking care of yourself if you're not going to get the care at your office.
Yeah. Well, and I do think many people work in places where it's not possible to talk about these feelings or to say you have anxiety, whether it's the organizational culture or the regional culture, it's just very taboo in some places still. And I like the idea. I go back to the CPU comment of like, can you clear your CPU from 10 to 5 or 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 whenever you need to be focused on work? And then, as you say, find people or resources to help you with anxiety outside those hours.
Right, because it's got to go somewhere. I think where we get into trouble is that and this is extremely common, right? That's why therapy is a booming business where, and as is massage therapy and body works, we don't allow ourselves to feel the anxiety and put it anywhere. And so we put it into ourselves and in our bodies, and that can be really hard. Yeah. But Amy, what I wanted to say is mental health stuff is taboo in our success-driven culture because we see it sometimes as being weak. I don't see it that way. I see it as being strong and in touch with yourself. But, a lot of organizations are very much command and control, never let them see you sweat. This is how we roll. I think that now everything's different. I mean, I was reading an article in the New York Times yesterday about how some of the biggest, most corporate companies in Manhattan are saying, we may keep our workers remote as long as we can. Yeah. The idea that you could be a power player at a Manhattan law firm and work from home was anathema 4 months ago. And I know because lawyers would call me up in tears saying, I just want to work from home one day a week, but I'll never make it. So things have changed. And if there's any silver lining in this, it's that maybe now is the time where we could talk about how we feel. We all feel anxious.
Yeah. So we actually have a question from Sharif from Egypt. It says, which is very relevant to what we're just talking about. How do you see the role of leaders in addressing their employees' anxiety?
Oh, well, thank you. That's my favorite question. Again, every leader is different. And what I love to think about is if you're a leader and you're ready to talk about anxiety, whether you're having a hard time and you want to share that with your team or your board or your boss, or you just want to open up the discussion, is to think about in advance how far you want to go. And then what kind of holding environment are you going to create for your team? Because ultimately, whether it's normal times or pandemic times, our job as leaders is to communicate clearly with our teams by a shared vision of how we're going to get where we need to go together. Make sure everyone on our team understands their role in where we're going and that they feel recognized as individuals. I mean, survey after survey after survey for the past 40 years has shown that employees, more than they want money, more than they want a fancy title or an office, want to feel that their individual contribution at their workplace is recognized and understood.
Right.
That's what people want.
Yeah.
And so how can you as a leader, in opening up a discussion, allow your people to feel heard and then also held, right? It's what Amy Cuddy talks about, warmth and competence.
Right.
So in this time, we want a leader who's normal. It is weird if you're a leader right now and you're not having any anxiety, right? Because we don't know what work will look like. We don't know if we will have, no one knows, right? That's the nature of a pandemic. So to admit that you're a little bit afloat, unsure, is human, and people need that from their leaders.
Mm-hmm.
But then they want to feel held. They want to know that you are competent. They want to know that you are going to do the best job you can to make sure they feel heard and to make sure they know what they need to do.
Yeah, I want to ask a little bit more about that, but first, just for those of us who are just joining us, I'm Amy Gallo, editor at HBR, and I'm talking with Morra Aarons-Mele, the host of the HBR podcast, The Anxious Achiever, about coping with anxiety and uncertainty at work. We want to answer your questions, so please use the comments, let us know what's on your mind and how we might be able to help. So Morra, I want to ask about that as leaders who want to sort of lean into this moment of authenticity and to admit that they're anxious, because as you say, it would seem odd that if they weren't, but also knowing that their team is relying on them to be this beacon and often to be optimistic, to keep them moving in the direction of positivity. Any advice around how to do that in a way that is both authentic to the leader, but not scary to their followers?
Well, that's right. Because what we instinctively react to and what fills us with fear is when we feel like, and I always think of children and their parents, when we feel that our leaders are about to fall apart,
mm-hmm.
right? We need the sense of this person is empathetic and we're sort of understanding how each other feel in this moment.
Mm.
They're not going to fall apart on me. I'm not going to have to take care of them because that's not right.
Yeah, that's the opposite, right?
Exactly. So the way that I would start is honestly to not be scared of anxiety and to understand that it's totally normal.
Mm.
If you hadn't eaten in 4 days and you said to your team, if you all hadn't eaten in 4 days for whatever reason, and you said, geez, I'm hungry.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'll be like, yeah, we're super hungry. We haven't eaten in 4 days.
Right.
So what? You're hungry. Eat some food.
Mm.
So the first thing that I would say is, and Dr. Angela Neal Barnett says this so beautifully on my podcast, and we have her in the article, is I'm anxious. I'm anxious. So what? I'm anxious.
Right.
These are hard times.
Mm-hmm.
I'm scared of what may come ahead, but I'm not scared of my anxiety. It's just, it's anxiety, and I can put things in place to deal with that. Yeah. And so the first step as a leader is really not feeling like it's the end of the world that you feel anxious. It's normal to feel anxious right now. Of course you're anxious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No big deal.
Yeah. I'm thinking of my daughter's preschool director who was, always gave great advice about how to talk to children. And one of his things was when you have to deliver sad news, a grandparent dying or something bad is happening, a teacher leaving, which can be really hard for a young kid, is to get to the place where you're not fighting your own feeling about it, because then you're the kid's not watching you struggle, you're allowing them to have their own struggle. And that's sort of what I'm thinking of as you're talking about the best way to communicate with your team.
Totally. And I always call it don't have an on-camera meltdown, right?
Mm.
So Carolyn Glass, who's a great therapist who I interview in the piece, her big thing is share the feeling, I'm anxious, with your team. How are you feeling? Save the mess for someone else, whether that's your therapist, your coach, a peer group. Don't let your team see the mess. And I think the parenting analogy is really important here because, of course, those of us who are parents and are also leaders, our kids are asking us basically the same question as our teams, which is, are we going to be okay here?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's totally normal to say, Mommy, I said this with my kid this morning, who's missing his end of fifth grade, transition to middle school, leadership, all that stuff. I said, sweetie, I'm sad too. We're so sad. This is so weird. This is awful. This is boring. The news is scary. We feel really upset and anxious. But here's what we're going to do to try to make it better. And here's what I can tell you. You don't need to lie, right? You don't need to lie and say things are going to be great. The economy is going to be perfect in 2 months, because you don't know that.
Right. We've gotten two different people asking the question, which again, I think you'll love this question. Can anxious people become good leaders in the future?
Well, anxious people can be good leaders now.
True.
Yes.
You were one of them. Yeah.
I think that many of our leaders are anxious, whether they have a clinical anxiety disorder or they just feel anxious because it's a normal human emotion. I think that, again, understanding your anxiety and what makes you anxious and how you react to it is a critical leadership skill. Because if you don't understand that, you can't communicate with the right modulation, you can't negotiate, you will be being triggered all day with stressors that you are not managing appropriately, right? So I would just say everyone gets anxious. Understanding why you in particular might be getting anxious from something and maybe someone else isn't, which is different than the pandemic because we're all anxious. Or what about the pandemic makes you especially anxious? Is it when you check the stock market and you think, oh my God, I'm never going to retire? Is it health? We all have different triggers. What triggers you? And then how are you reacting? That's a leadership skill.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to ask a little bit about self-compassion because we've gotten a few questions. Marima from Bosnia and Herzegovina says, how can I forgive myself for not achieving the set goals, whether it due to be outside obstacles like COVID or just the lack of discipline? We also have a question from Abhishek from India. Says, how should one absorb the embarrassment that failure brings? How can I motivate myself to try again despite my anxiety? I'm curious your thoughts on sort of how to move past failures or lack of motivation at this moment.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, what I hear in both those questions is shame. You know, I'm ashamed of myself, either because I feel that I should be doing something more extraordinary during this time than I am, or I'm ashamed of myself because I failed. And I think that a lot of anxiety is fear of being shamed, right? And so when you can understand the shame, a lot of the anxiety will go away. And of course, Dr. Brene Brown has written so many wonderful books on this topic that I really would encourage you to feel. I think that to address the first question about pandemic achievement.
Yes.
Yeah. Thing. Oh my gosh, where do I start? Right? Like, who cares if you're not coming up with the next innovative business idea or making beautiful bread or whatever.
Learning to play piano.
Or, coming up with the next mask sewn in your basement that's going to save 1 million lives. That's okay. It's really a time right now. And trust me, I'm trying to do this myself because I also have been feeling shame. I run a small business. My small business is really down. I talk about this in the article. I felt ashamed of that. I felt like it was my fault.
Right.
And when I applied for PPP, I didn't want to because I felt ashamed. Because I don't run a restaurant. I run a digital business. So people are using the internet more than ever. Why is my business exploding? In fact, a couple of people have said that to me, not intentionally, not in a cruel way, but like, oh, I bet you're busy. Everyone's online right now. And that just sent a shame bomb into me. Oh my God, Morra, you suck.
Right. We have a great comment from someone who says it's not failure, it's your soul growing, which I think is really helpful. Yeah.
Look, the only failure right now, right, is going outside and coughing on people, right? We all just need to get through this and be as kind and considerate as we can.
Yeah. Maura, you've mentioned it a few times, but I want to just let our viewers know you wrote this wonderful article for our Big Idea section called Leading Through Anxiety. It just went up this week. It's loaded with lots of practical advice along the lines of what we've talked about here. So if anyone watching is interested in that, you can find that at hbr.org. But I'm curious, just what's the response you've gotten to the article so far? Like I said, it went up on Tuesday, so it's been 48 hours. What have you heard from people?
It's been amazing. I've been honored. I think that people really want to feel seen in their feelings right now. And the thing that I'm proud of about the article and all the work, Amy, that we're doing at HBR is that understanding that we are ourselves, whether we're working, parenting, socializing, and my biggest dream is for people to just understand that feelings are normal, anxiety is normal. If we understand it, it can make us really better at our jobs and we don't need to hide it. And so seeing the reception to the article has made me feel like maybe we're getting closer to that. It's been great.
Yeah. The last line of the article is about telling a different story about anxiety. And I think that's a lot of your work is focused on that. And it's just been a pleasure to work with you on it. And thank you so much for joining me today on this LinkedIn Live. And I hope it's been helpful to everyone watching. Maura, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Amy. Be well, everyone. Be safe.
Take care, everyone. Thanks so much.